You know, sometimes a vase turns out to be a vase. You know what the difference in a vase is? A vase, if you're from Alabama, costs $18 at the flea market. But a vase is worth $45,000 and just got auctioned off somewhere, really in an expensive, nice place. You know, but sometimes the greatest treasures come in an ordinary vase or an ordinary pot or an ordinary jar. You know, I remember being a kid and going to my grandmother's house, and she had a cookie jar. I remember seeing it so well. I can still picture exactly what it looks like. It was white, and it had blue accents on it. Around the middle of it was a little thing of different kinds of flowers, and they were all painted blue. I knew when I went to her house that inside that ordinary little jar that cost almost nothing, that there could be treasure. There could be cookies of some form or description, or some kind of dessert or snack that she had made and had waiting on me when I got there. And I knew I could always go to that spot. So what was the container wasn't valuable, but what was inside was what really mattered. A good example of this took place in 1947. A young boy, a Bedouin shepherd, he found a ceramic jar inside of a cave when he was throwing rocks into a cave around the area around Qumran. And this area was overlooking the Dead Sea. And he found scrolls when he went inside because he heard the jars break. He didn't know what they were. He sold 3 of them for $29. Later, when it was determined that there were a lot more of these in those caves, it was a collection of biblical manuscripts of the Old Testament containing all the books of the Old Testament, sometimes multiple copies, except for the book of Esther. The book of Esther is the only book that wasn't accounted for. And it was the Dead Sea Scrolls. They took us back 1,000 years. 1,000 years before we had any other complete copies of the Old Testament. We went backwards. That's absolutely incredible. The coolest part of that is when they compared the oldest copies they had to the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was almost universally unchanged to see how God had taken care of His Word across that time. But when we think about those clay pots that were holding those scrolls, the pots were average. They were ordinary. It was what in them that made them so special. And Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Listen to what it says in verse 7. He says there, "We now have this light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves." Now that word there used to describe these clay jars, that Greek word that you find there in verse 7, it's just referring to ordinary earthenware, ordinary stuff. These clay pots, they were used by common people to store grain, maybe to put money in. You know, I've got a how many has got a jar at home where we put all our change, and when the change jar fills up, we go turn it in, or we roll it up into sets, and we take it and get some money. I like to do that and then go buy like a video game or some shoes or something. It's kind of my little extra side money over here. The people back in the Old Testament, they would use it to keep oil in for lighting their lamps. They did all kind of things with them. So Paul is saying we're not a vase from the Ming Dynasty, okay? We're simple. We're brown pots. We're jars of clay. We're not a vase. We're a vase. You can buy it at Walmart. So there's 2 things that we know about these clay pots and these cookie jars and the jars we keep our change in. They're fragile. They're easily broken. We're ordinary clay pots. See, that's the cool thing. God delights in that. He uses us so many times because of what it does for us and then what it speaks about Him. That if God can use fragile people, ordinary people, to change the world, that's incredible. And that's what He does with us. You know, we think about these great men and women that have done so much for the cause of the gospel and for people throughout the world. You know, I think about a man like Billy Graham that led more people to the Lord as an individual than probably anybody else in the history of the world. You know, I think about great pastors and leaders and people that have done great things for the Lord. I think about missionaries like Lottie Moon and Annie Armstrong and Adoniram Judson. I think about these men and women that gave of themselves and the impact that they had on the world. They're just regular people. See, the thing is, don't shortchange yourself. You know, when I go back and I look there again and I look in verse 7, where it says there, we have this light shining in our hearts, but we're just fragile jars containing this treasure. We may be ordinary people, but our God is not. He is extraordinary. And in His wisdom, He chose to use many times the simplest people and the simplest things to take His message to the world. I mean, think about it. When Christ came, He didn't go to the Pharisees. He didn't go to the great religious leaders. You know, God passed over Socrates with the message of the gospel. He didn't send Christ to him. He passed over Plato. He passed over Euclid, the mathematician, Archimedes, the father of mechanics. He passed over all of these great minds and these people that history has said were so incredible, and they were geniuses, absolutely. But who did God send the message of the gospel out through? He put in these little clay pots this priceless message of the gospel. He gave it to fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, the least likely people that the world would ever think. And He used them. So you may think, hey, I'm just an ordinary person. I can't make a difference. So is everybody else in the Bible, just ordinary people. They're no different either. But God has given us His message. He's placed it within us. And He chose to use these ordinary, fragile, breakable pieces of pottery that are us to change the world. So stop worrying about what you can accomplish and start focusing on what your God that you serve, what He can accomplish. We may be fragile, ordinary earthenware. We may be a vase and not a vase, but our God is absolutely extraordinary. Hope you have a great discussion tonight during your study.